And the center is celebrating its 45th birthday this year. And for the last 4.5 decades has been deeply committed to facilitating equal educational opportunities for culturally and linguistically diverse students, including myself. I'm a proud alum of our camp, Career Ladders, and Master of Arts program. And I can tell you that I'm confident that if it weren't for the BUENO Center, I wouldn't be here with you today. I know that the support I received from the center completely changed the trajectory of my life. So I am truly grateful to spend the next hour with each of you. Our mission at the center is to promote and advocate for equitable education for culturally and linguistically diverse learners, families, and the educators who serve them. We believe that equity and social justice advance education and improve lives and communities. And to this end, we conduct relevant and timely research focused on bilingual, multicultural, and special education from early childhood through adulthood. If you are new to our Lunchtime speaker series, as I am, these are events that have been organized for the last few years by Dr. Millie Gort in collaboration with the BUENO Center that have covered a wide range of topics and research related to culturally and linguistically diverse education and equity, including speakers who are current faculty, doctoral students, and colleagues from nearby institutions, as well as from across the country. This is our first virtual speaker series and the first time that we aren't providing attendees with lunch in person. So we hope you have brought your own lunch and please enjoy it while you listen to our speaker today. Now, without further ado, on behalf of the BUENO Center, again, I welcome each of you and thank you for joining us. I will turn it over now to Dr. Gort, who is one of our amazing faculty associates and professor in equity, bilingualism, and biliteracy to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jesus. Welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure. I'm going to take about 45 seconds to introduce our wonderful speaker. I could spend probably hours talking about her, but I want to give her the time to actually share her work with us. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Rebecca Linares. As you saw from the ads about the talk, she examines the bilingual and multilingual literacies, transnational literacy practices, and translanguaging practices of emergent multilingual adolescents, particularly those who are speakers of indigenous languages. She's specifically interested in how young people access and utilize literacy knowledge in their home languages to negotiate their participation in new and shifting cultural and linguistic landscapes. Rebecca earned her PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2017 in curriculum and instruction with a focus on language and literacy and bilingual education, and her master's in Latin American studies in 2012. She joined us this past year here at CU Boulder as faculty member in our program area, Equity, Bilingualism, and Biliteracy. We could not be more thrilled that she joined us and that we got to be her colleague. And we are very excited to hear about some of her work that she's been conducting recently, her most recent work. And I turn it over now to Dr. Linares. Thank you so much. We're very excited.
Thank you so much for that really, really nice introduction. And it's great to be here and be part of the BUENO Center and the work that's happening there, and to get to share space and time with folks who are really committed to the needs and experiences of multilingual people. So I'm excited. I'm going to screen share my slides here. All right, so hopefully there you're seeing cool. All right. I got a thumb up. So thank you. So I'm Rebecca. The title of my presentation today is Maintaining Connections, Cultivating Community, the Role of Transnational Translingual Literacy Sponsorships in One Adolescent's Literacy Practices. So just a little agenda for how I'll kind of move through the presentation. I don't really need to do personal introduction because I had a really lovely introduction from Dr. Gort. So I will just kind of briefly go through that and then focus in on a little bit of the research that I'm doing right now and some of the writing that I'm doing around literacy sponsorships, specifically transnational translingual literacy sponsorships in the life of one young woman. And then I'll talk a little bit about where I see some room for future research, and then open it up for questions and discussion if folks have comments and stuff. So let's see. All right, so a little bit on personal background. So I'm new to CU Boulder. It's been an exciting and interesting first year with all the things that have happened over the last couple of months. But it's been great. So I'm in equity, bilingualism, and biliteracy here at CU Boulder. And like Dr. Gort said, I earned my PhD from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in curriculum and instruction. I'm a heritage learner and speaker of Spanish. I grew up in a bilingual home, but not in much of a bilingual community outside of that in Kentucky. So that's shaped some of my interests in adolescence multilingualism. So today I'm going to share an aspect of my research that is looking at the role of transnational translingual literacy sponsorships in shaping and supporting the languaging and literacy practices of one young woman who arrived to the United States as an unaccompanied minor. Before I jump into kind of the specifics of my study and the specifics of this young woman's experience, I wanted to first have like a brief introduction to who unaccompanied minors are. We're seeing that term kind of come up a lot in the media right now, and I just want to contextualize it just a little bit to give us some context for thinking through some of the data that I'll share and some of the experiences that I'll highlight that this young person went through in Kentucky. So an unaccompanied minor is essentially, and I use the term unaccompanied minor, the US government, you may see the acronym UAC, they used unaccompanied alien child. That's not a term that I use, but it is a term that is used. But essentially an unaccompanied minor is a young person who arrives in the United States or at the US-Mexico, or any border, essentially. I'm talking about the US-Mexico border, but arrives at a border without a parent or legal guardian with them, and without legal status at that point to be entering or staying in the United States. I have here a table that highlights the last decade or so, the number of unaccompanied minors that we have seen be apprehended at the US-Mexico border. The majority of these young people across the last decade plus are coming from the Northern Triangle of Central America. So they are primarily from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The majority of them who have been surveyed, who are going through this trajectory that I'll talk about in just a minute, talk about really serious things that they're fleeing, really serious situations and experiences that have informed their decision or their parents' and families' decisions for them to make this journey through parts of Central America, through Mexico, and into the United States. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. A lot of the conversation and a lot of the language that's used to talk about this demographic criminalizes them, it dehumanizes them, it decontextualizes their experiences and ignores all of these reasons that they are essentially finding themselves forced to leave their homes and to leave their home countries. So things like violent crime, gang violence, economic instability, political instability, legacies of civil war. There are many, many things that have affected young people's decision to leave. And this quote is from 2020, but it resonates for young people across the last decade more plus, right? This idea that, parents are not being neglectful in either encouraging or supporting their child to make this decision, or even, accompanying their child through this process and choosing to move, right? This is a decision that people have made because of really extreme circumstances that they're experiencing in their home communities and their home countries. So I did this study just to give you some context here in this history. I did this study across the 2015-2016 year, following what President Obama declared this humanitarian crisis in 2014, because we were seeing, an increase in the number, a drastic increase compared to previous years. But you can see that right now, the numbers that we're seeing in the last year or so still very much mirror. There has not been much change in terms of how many children are making this decision between when I did this study and where we are today. 2020 was, an unusual year because of the pandemic, but we're seeing those numbers start to pick back up and mirror where we have, what we've seen in the last couple of years. So again, for just a little bit more context, I find that when I talk about this with students and with other people, there's this question around how does a young person go from, self-surrendering or being apprehended at the border to being in a classroom in the context of this classroom in Kentucky? Like, what is that process like? What is that time period like? And so I created this table that kind of captures some of the, the systems that are in place for receiving and essentially processing young people as they go through this, this resettlement process. So just to kind of give you a quick summary of sort of the checkpoints that are in place, when a child is detained or they self-surrender to U.S. Customs and Border Patrol agent, they will find themselves placed in a detention facility on the border. That's that initial kind of point of contact that happens on the U.S. side of the U.S.-Mexico border. And that's an important distinction, whether that apprehension or that contact happens in Mexico versus whether it happens in the United States. When it happens in the United States, then we see children being placed into these detention centers where essentially a Border Patrol agent is determining that child's age and trying to determine the reason that they have left their home country. Because they're minors, so if the border agent determines that a child's under 18 years old, they have 72 hours in which they're supposed to transfer that child to the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so essentially, the Office of Refugee Resettlement is responsible for determining whether that child, like the critical things that they're thinking about, whether the child has been a victim of human trafficking and or whether the child has quote unquote credible, which is a challenging term, a credible fear of persecution or torture if they were to be returned to their home country. So there's a lot of gray actually in that. But so for reference, I mean, because of the numbers that we see, because of how long these numbers have been where they are, these checkpoints are not short. So they have 72 hours in that initial period, but then the average right now that I noted here is there's an 150-day average period that kids are spending in this office under the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So during that time, what's happening is this office is responsible for identifying whether or not that child also has someone in the country who can serve as a temporary sponsor and who will take that child for a period of temporary resettlement, or in the case of the student that I worked with, reunification. So if a child is determined not to have somebody, a caregiver, a parent, a guardian who can take on that responsibility, they move into a long-term foster care detention center. And then technically they're supposed to be provided with basic education services. The students that I worked with are part of that other track. So they had family members who had previously been in the United States who were able to serve as kind of temporary sponsors for those young people as they await their court hearings. So again, I put quotations around that term temporary because there's very little that is temporary about it. The backlog of cases of young people awaiting their initial court hearing is more than 2 years right now. It's been increasing and increasing and increasing. So you have young people that are in a lot of limbo. They're in this very ambiguous place, but they're there for a while. And so in the meantime, they're encouraged to enroll in a local public school. So children, what happens then as they get resettled, for example, Paula, that I'll talk about in just a little bit, moving to Kentucky and being resettled with family, they're finding themselves encouraged by immigrant advocates and those who are working with an immigration lawyer, being encouraged to enroll in public schools because it can help their case supposedly to have an affiliation with the school and to show that they're committed to learning English and to going to school and all these other complicated pieces. So the reality of that is, though, that we have districts, we have schools, we have teachers who are underprepared, right? It's a demographic of student that they have not necessarily worked with in the past. And it's a demographic of student that has really complex needs. that go beyond just educational needs. There are personal, there are socio-emotional, there are health needs that, you know, that need to be taken into account in order for that child to be in a place where they can be, you know, open to learning and open to being in a school setting. The other piece is often some of these young people didn't necessarily plan to go to school. That wasn't part of their, you know, what they wanted to do when they moved to the United States. A lot of them have a focus on working or other things, and here they are finding themselves in a classroom. Padilla talked about this idea of the Central American transnational imaginary to describe sort of the experiences that many transnational Central American Northern Triangle young people are coming in with, that they have had experiences with violence, with gangs, with political instability, with civil war. And also she talks a lot about that potentially traumatic experience of migration, of moving through their home country, of moving through Mexico and into the United States, some of which, you know, some of these children are doing this independently or with siblings, and others are doing it, you know, under the quote unquote care of a human trafficker. So there are a lot of things that are kind of background that a child's bringing into a classroom, or that a young person is bringing into the classroom. So it was kind of in that context, and knowing that context, that I became interested in looking at the experiences of young people coming out of that process and entering into a new community in my case, in the state of Kentucky. So I started a year-long ethnographic case study that really was focused on documenting the first year experiences and literacy and language practices of young people who fit into this category of having had some of these experiences. So I worked with 5 young people who were recently arrived to Kentucky, recently resettled in Kentucky, who were Indigenous identifying, transnational in the sense that they maintained connections to people and places and languages and emotions on multiple sides of multiple borders, and who are multilingual Guatemalan students. So I have a little table that kind of gives you a summary of their ages and their language background. So they were Quiché and Spanish speakers, and one student also identified as a heritage speaker of Cachiquel. So I worked with these 5 students across one school year. I worked with them primarily at the school in the context of one classroom, which was a classroom at their sheltered English school in Kentucky. So this was a newcomer school, actually, that the district had designed because they were receiving so many students that they classified as having an interrupted formal education. And so this newcomer school came about as a place to serve those students, generally in their first 2 years of formal schooling in Kentucky, before they would then be resettled out or placed into another school, maybe potentially closer to where they live. So in today's presentation, I'm going to talk primarily about the experiences of Paula, about her languaging and literacy practices. So Paula was a 16-year-old young woman. She identified, and I'll share some quotes where she's talking about this a little bit, as a Quiché speaker, and then as a second language speaker of Spanish, now finding herself in Kentucky. So a little bit more on Paula. She had completed her formal schooling through the end of 6th grade. She received her 6th grade diploma. Like I said, she identified as a Quiché and Spanish speaker. You can see that way that she talks a little bit about this. Since my mom speaks Quiché, my dad too, I grew up already speaking Quiché. She talks about this idea of having been born of the Quiché language and learning Spanish and studying Spanish later when she started to attend school in Guatemala. So after completing her 6th grade diploma, she worked with her family as an artisan. Her family, they wove, sorry, I lost the word. They were weavers. And so they created a lot of artisanal pieces of art and also clothing, like the backpack, dresses and blouses, belts, things like that, and they would sell them. And that was primarily how the family subsisted and lived. And this was actually a practice that one of her sister-in-laws taught her, but it was a practice that all the women participated in her home, in her multi-generational home. So that was the context that she was leaving in Guatemala. And the context that she came into in the United States was a little bit complicated, a little bit difficult, and for her a little bit unexpected. So she found out after moving to Kentucky that one of her brothers, she had been living with actually her sister-in-law was one of the women she lived with in Guatemala. One of her brothers had actually been the victim of a hit and run accident near their home and had been left in essentially requiring around the clock care. He was not able to walk, to work, to talk, to feed himself, anything like that. So you can see her talking a little bit. You can see her talking a little bit about that here. He was hit by a car. While he was walking to work, he has a tube, and now we give him food through that tube, and he doesn't speak. So Paula found this situation in her home when she came to Kentucky. And as I talk about her literacy practices here in just a bit, we can see how this context really shapes some of the literacy practices that she's finding herself engaging in. So, like I said, the study was a year-long ethnographic case study. I focused primarily on observations, on interviews, and on collecting artifacts. So part of that artifact collection also took the form of providing students with digital cameras and inviting them to take pictures of anything that they wanted outside of the classroom that had to do with how they language. So anything you're reading, you're writing, you're talking about, you're listening to, anything you see that makes you want to think or reflect on language, like document any and all of that, and we'll chat about it. So in today's presentation, I'm primarily drawing on interview and artifact data that Paula shared with me. So to give you a little bit of an idea of kind of the theoretical groundings for how I'm thinking about this, and also to kind of contextualize some of the language that I use and have been using around literacy. So how I think about literacy, I think, is important for understanding the rest of this presentation. So for me and for many, this idea of literacy is more than, neutral skills for reading and writing and using language or creating or consuming text, right? I think of literacy, as multiple practices that are socially constructed, that are negotiated within specific contexts and vary across specific contexts as they are in conversation and sometimes tension with hierarchies of power in different spaces. So this, helps me think about this idea of kind of rejecting this notion of people being able to regulate who gets to be considered literate and who gets to, what gets to be considered literacy. I think this understanding of literacy kind of moves beyond that to say literacy looks and sounds and feels different in different contexts based on some of these other components at play. So in that sense, thinking about being literate, what it means to be literate, I think a lot about this notion from Freire and Macedo and others, this idea of reading the word and the world, right? That when we consume or create a text or produce language, that we're interpreting that text or that language in the context of the world in which it was created or in which it's being consumed. That there's this fluidity that goes back and forth between, literacies within contexts. Specific contexts. And so that also then shapes how I think about literacy practices and how I understand the literacy practices that I'm going to talk about in the rest of the presentation, just as, describing the ways that people use language in everyday lives and thinking about how that language use is a reflection of the context. It's a reflection of values and attitudes and experiences and social relationships and social dynamics, all of that shaping what a literacy practice is in terms of how the language is being used or created. So in order to analyze the literacy practices and to help me kind of make sense of what I was seeing in the literacy practices, I draw on three theoretical bodies primarily. So the first is border theory, which helps me kind of unpack the role and impact of not just physical borders that shape transnational emergent multilinguals' lives, but also the inanimate and emotional borders that border crossers are negotiating all day, every day. So borders across, that are linguistic, that are cultural, that are gendered, that are social, that are political, that are economic, right? These are tensions and borders that transnational people actually in general always are negotiating. And so I use that to help me think about these different spaces that Paula's navigating. And then I use translanguaging to help me kind of think about and understand this fluid movement that multilingual and multidialectical people experience between and across languages. So this idea that we have one linguistic repertoire or one communication system that we're drawing from fluidly, and depending on context and situation that we're in. And then this last piece is around transnational, translingual literacy sponsorships, which is really helping me kind of unpack and understand how Paula's, for example, but young people's in general, participation in literacy practices is supported and sometimes facilitated through relationships that they maintain across time and space. So Center Sapico talked about this idea of sponsorships in terms of people serving as either indirect, direct, or motivator sponsor. So an indirect sponsor being someone who makes resources available to somebody, a direct sponsor being someone who engages actively in teaching and learning with someone, and a motivator being someone who encourages someone else to engage in a practice or to take something up. And so that helps me kind of think about who all the participants are in Paula's literacy practices and in the ways that she's engaging in these literacy practices. So some of the literature that this is grounded in centers around the complexities, the literature that has shown how complex and varied and multifaceted the language and literacy practices of transnational youth are, despite how they might be finding themselves positioned in more formal spaces like a classroom where they're labeled limited English or interrupted, or all these other kind of deficit-oriented labels that get imposed on children. This literature has found that, in fact, young people are engaged in really complex and varied literacy practices. The other piece that I'm thinking of, the other body of literature that I'm drawing on a lot here, is around the role of families and communities in young people's literacy and language development. This idea that whether a child has family members or community members living directly with them, they are often still very connected with those communities, particularly now where we have so much digital technology that helps us maintain and keep those connections. And often families are super supportive and super involved in young people's literacies and languages development. And then I have a quote here that I think really kind of grounds and guides me, which is a little bit older, but I still find very relevant and very moving, which is this idea that we need to be thinking, that we need to think specifically about young people, about adolescents, about teenagers, and explore and unpack how they're using language and literacy across these different contexts that they're navigating. Young people are navigating so many different spaces, digitally, virtually, but also in person, and to think through how they're making sense of language and literacy in those different spaces as they build relationships and find places for themselves in new communities. So that's really a lot of where some of this work is coming from for me. So the research questions that I'm taking up in this particular piece center around exploring the kinds of literacy practices that Paula described engaging in and how she talked about engaging them, and then thinking about how these literacy practices reflect aspects of her identity, reflect aspects of her positionality, and even her circumstances at the time. That will be a piece that I think about as well. So essentially, through my analysis, I'm thinking about, and sort of the kind of key ideas that I'm working with right now are around how Paula engaged in these multimodal, translingual literacy practices, how they sustained her. So how they sustained her personally and spiritually, intellectually and socially across these different linguistic and cultural contexts that she's navigating. And then, like I said, another big piece of this is thinking about how her engagement in these literacy practices was sustained through the support that she sought out or maintained either locally or transnationally with people that she already had relationships with, or, like I'll describe in a few minutes, people that she developed and initiated relationships with. So I'm going to think and talk with you a little bit about how she engaged in cooking, how she engaged in religious fellowship and discussion, how she engaged in independent studying of English, and then finally the role of translingual socializing for her as kind of core literacy practices that she documented and shared with me. So this first literacy practice is about cooking. It's around cooking, and to some degree also caregiving as a literacy practice in Paula's life. So I mentioned that her home life is a little bit unique. She lives with her father and with 3 brothers, all of whom work outside of the home. So she found herself outside of going to school every day, spending a lot of time by herself at home, and sometimes with her family, but often, you know, taking care of her brother while her other siblings worked and while her father worked. So she also found that because of that, and because of how she was positioned in general, one of the kind of core responsibilities that she was tasked with was around cooking. You can see in this first quote, though, the way that she's thinking about her own identity in terms of how the role she played in her home in Guatemala, where she says, I didn't cook, I couldn't cook, right? I lived with all these other women who took on that role. That was not a role that was really given to me at that, you know, at that point in my life. So because of the family dynamics in her multi-generational home there, she never really took up that practice. So now finding herself in Kentucky, she is sort of being tasked with this. The expectation from her father, from her brother, is that this is something that she'll do. So we can see her saying, you know, she had to learn, like this is something she didn't really know how to do. And so she talks about how she engaged with her mother through WhatsApp to learn how to cook. And so she talks about how these exchanges were oral. She memorized the recipes, and they took place in Quiche. That was her mother's language, and so that was her language, and so that was the language that they used for her mom to teach her these recipes. And this, you can see here in the last quote here, that then she takes that information that her mother gives her, and she goes to Chapinlandia, which is the name of a grocery store in Kentucky, where she's able to purchase the ingredients that she needs to create these meals that her mother's teaching her. And she was talking about, you know, like who she's met there, and she says, you know, they speak Mam. So she had interacted with the owners of that store, who she found out were speakers of Mam, another indigenous language. So it's interesting because she's creating these kind of translingual, transnational spaces at home on her own. But then in her larger community, like I said, Kentucky, you know, initially many people don't think of Kentucky as a diverse space, but there are these transnational, translingual communities there, and she's starting to plug into them. And so we can see that happening here at Chapinlandia. So on the next slide, there's a picture of raw meat. I always feel like, I don't know, maybe that makes people queasy. So if it does, you can look away. So this is a picture, a few pictures that Paula took of some of the food that she was cooking. So this first picture is of her roasting corn. And then the other three pictures are some of the steps that she goes through to make a caldo de pollo that her mom taught her from scratch. So she's defeathering a chicken in that first picture that's up there. So here I'm thinking, you know, within the context of this practice, I'm thinking about how oral language and recipe sharing kind of represents this duality for Paula. She's, you know, she's in some ways very much a child, a daughter. She's still being guided translingually by her mother, but she's also taking on these new roles as a young adult and as a caregiver to some degree. You know, because of her gender, she talks about it like, it's only me and my brothers. Therefore, the implication is that's my responsibility. So she's navigating this kind of multiple roles that are in some ways being imposed upon her, but that she's taking up. So the oral recipe sharing in Quiche through WhatsApp also shows how she's maintaining these relationships. She's maintaining these relationships that are allowing her to meet these new expectations. And it's also showing the active role that her mom's playing in kind of her day-to-day life, despite the distance between the two of them. So this next piece that I want to talk about is how Paula cultivated community through religious fellowship. So as I mentioned, she really spends a lot of time at home by herself, caring for her brother. And so she was looking for ways to create community and to create opportunities for connection with other people. So as you can see in this quote, Paula found ways of leveraging connections through a neighbor to create opportunities for herself to build community and to create opportunities for connection in her home. So she, through this neighbor, built a relationship with two members of Jehovah's Witness that her neighbor had connections with, who were coming to her house, and they were bringing the Bible study and materials to her home. So she essentially used this relationship. She reaches out to them, she connects with them. They are Spanish speakers and English speakers themselves. And so she uses this relationship to create a situation where she kind of finds access to religious texts and materials, and also to people that she can read and discuss the Bible with in her own home. So allowing her to still maintain those responsibilities. I think too, in this quote, though, we can also see again this kind of duality that she's thinking about and that she's navigating. So she's also saying, she's showing this awareness of kind of her own position, her own vulnerability as a young woman interacting with two older men. So initially they're two strangers. And so she's, instead of letting those kinds of potential worries kind of prevent this interaction from happening, she works it so that they come to her house when her brothers are there. And then she takes on this practice of Bible study. She carries on that practice on her own with her family. When they're together. So it's something that's initially happening through the fellowshipping with these two people, but then later, like she says here, I read the Bible out loud with my dad and my brothers, and we talk about it. This is a conversation. So in this picture that Paula took, this is a picture of some of the materials that these two members had shared with her. They're both in Spanish. And then this is actually a picture of one of their meetings. So you can see on the left, the two Jehovah's Witness members, and then on the right, two of her brothers and her father. So here I'm thinking about how Paula is identifying opportunities for community building, how she's really actively looking for connection, and then how she's sustaining the practices that she's learning and engaging in that communal space on her own or with her family members when the two members of the organization aren't there. So I'm also thinking here about how her ability to do this kind of activity, to do this kind of fellowshipping, it's facilitated by the Jehovah's Witness members in one way physically, right? Like they're there offering companionship and dialoguing with her, but also through these materials that they then leave her with that she is able to engage on her own with as she moves forward. So the next piece that I want to talk about is around how her immediate family supported her language and literacy development. So specifically, she talks about engaging in independent study of English. And this started when she came home from school. You can see in the quote, she came home from school feeling frustrated and telling her father about some of the difficulties she's experiencing learning English in this sheltered English classroom at school. Her dad is a Quiché and Spanish speaker. He's been living in the United States for 10 years at this point, but works in a setting that is Spanish dominant. So English is not a language he's acquired, but he's still finding ways to support her English development because that's an interest she's expressed to him. So she describes here that he brings her this workbook and DVD set that's focused on English language development. And so this resource was multimodal, it has DVDs, she talks about like putting them on and listening to them. And it was something she was able to engage in on her own, again, in some of this solitary time that she has, at home after school. So here's a conversation too, where she's going on talking a little bit more about some of her independent working and her independent studying at home, but in this case, how it's facilitated by her brother. So this is a conversation about what I asked her what she does when she gets stuck, when she doesn't understand something. And she talks about how, well, first she says, I'd ask the teacher, well, okay, well, when you're at home, what would you do? And so she says, I'd look at my dictionary. And she talks about this resource that her brother gave her that allows her to continue moving on her own independently. You can see she says, like, I go there, like, how do you say this? And then I go and I look it up and I'm going to understand. So she's learning how to use this resource that her brother's made available to her. So this is a picture of some of that material that her dad had given her that she took. This is kind of what she works with when she's engaging with this material. And so here I'm thinking about how Paula is articulating her feelings and her experiences to her dad. She's expressing to him frustration and how he is indirectly supporting her, right? Maybe he doesn't know immediately how to help her with some of this English homework or, these materials, but he's providing resources, as is her brother. Again, both of them may or may not necessarily be able to support her with some of the homework and things like that, given their own language backgrounds and time, right? They're all working and she's, doesn't have as much opportunity to interact with them. So they're still finding ways to help her contextualize what's happening at school with what at home and on her own. So the last literacy practice that I'm thinking about is slightly different because this one took place in the classroom, but I think is interesting in how it represents how Paula's thinking about her linguistic and cultural identity in these different spaces, at school, at home, across these places, and the role that language is playing in the relationship building that's happening in these spaces. So in this first quote, she's talking about how she socializes at school. And she talks, initially she's saying, like, I use primarily Spanish, but then she also mentions that with another young woman who she realized speaks Quiché, she finds them speaking Quiché. She finds them, moving into another language. So she's, they end up speaking sometimes Spanish, sometimes they end up speaking Quiche. So she also describes the process similar when she's talking about practicing English, right? In the second quote, where she's like, I might be practicing English and then Quiche or Spanish ends up coming out, right? This is really representative of that idea of translanguaging, of how multilingual people are we're fluidly moving between and across languages, sometimes really unconsciously. But then you can see in this second piece that she's talking in some ways about how she's really aware of her language and her languaging, and how she's strategically using Quiche at school. So here she talks about, she kind of describes herself taking on this role of translating things that might have been said in Quiche among Quiche speakers, but Spanish speakers that share the classroom space are sort of left out of. And so she's saying, like, since I was born speaking Quiche, that's the way she describes it, I can take on this role of translating and bringing other people into the fold of this conversation. So she's taking on this role, this kind of awareness of how she can leverage her language to include or exclude people in some of these social exchanges. So this is the picture that Paula took of what she's calling her new home. This is kind of the landscape of where she's finding herself in Kentucky, that she took on a weekend walk. And so in this final context, I'm thinking about how her translanguaging at times is really subconscious. Like she says that, I end up speaking another language, and how other times it allowed her, she's super aware of it, right? And it's like allowing her to turn these social interactions into larger translingual literacy practices that really represent how she's negotiating this larger communicative context of a multilingual classroom that is technically, a sheltered English classroom, how she's like taking on her understanding of that larger space, and then choosing to leverage her own languaging and her own relationships through language in that space. And again, contextualizing that in this larger new linguistic landscape in Kentucky that is simultaneously very English dominant in some ways, but in other ways, like with Chapinlandia and with her languaging at school, very transnational and very translingual. So a few things that I'm thinking about broadly here. Essentially, I'm thinking about how the practices that she engaged in reflected the reality of her new life, right? Some of the demands and the responsibilities that she is finding herself taking on, and how she's navigating all of that. So they reflect how she's meeting some of the demands and how she's meeting some of these new responsibilities. I think they also, they reflect this desire to learn English, right? This desire, this kind of how she's seeing herself in this larger, English landscape in Kentucky, but then also finding, like I said, these transnational and translingual spaces in this context. So there's this there is this desire to learn English, but there's also this desire to maintain home languages and to continue building and cultivating connections to people that also have connections to those home languages or to those home country and home languages. So I'm also thinking about how, like I said, how she's enacting her multilingualism in these diverse spaces and contexts, how she's doing that and why. So some of this is happening in spaces like her sheltered English classroom, for example, that may traditionally not have accepted it, or not really, they're surely not welcoming it, right? Or creating space for it, but she's still negotiating that, and she's still finding opportunities to bring language in, to bring her languages in. And I think that that's representative of this notion of translingualism and of translanguaging, this idea that, for multilingual people, it's moving through and across languages is a natural way of being. It's how people make sense of their world. It's how people interact with their world. So Paula has experienced that since childhood, being born of Quiche and then learning Spanish in school. Like, these are experiences that she has, and borders that she has navigated since childhood. And then finally, I'm thinking about how her ability to engage in these practices, how her languaging is facilitated through these transnational and translingual sponsorships that she's either seeking out or that she's maintaining, and how these sponsorships and how these relationships are essentially granting her access to bodies of knowledge, to community, to resources that she wouldn't otherwise have been able to access. So she's building these connections, maintaining these connections as best she can in order to grant herself access to other things. So with her mother, I'm thinking about how she's serving as a direct sponsor. She's involved in kind of the day-to-day teaching with Paula of these skills that she needs for daily life. The Jehovah's Witnesses are both direct and indirect sponsors that are providing materials, but they're also engaging with her, dialogically engaging with her around this Bible study. Her father and her brother, who are indirect sponsors and motivators, they're making material available, and they're also encouraging her to continue learning English since she's expressed that as an interest. And then her classmates, who are both Quiche speakers and non-Quiche speakers, who are serving as indirect sponsors that facilitate opportunities for her to center and validate her Quiche in the classroom in this case. So a couple of just concluding thoughts. So I think that Paula's experience align with a lot of the research that shows that transnational emergent multilinguals, unaccompanied minors, families might not be physically present in their child's lives. They might not be in the same homes, but they are very often super active and involved in their children's learning. And the ways that they're supporting their young people's, their children's language and literacy development is complex, and it's worthy of recognition. And I think too, Paula shows us a lot how transnational emergent multilinguals are agentive. Like, she is strategic in navigating space. She's strategic in leveraging relationships so that she can build herself a community and a social network that supports her, one, sustaining her emotionally and spiritually and all of that, but also pragmatically, how is she, leveraging these relationships to fit the, the kind of constraints of her daily life, right? This inability to be out in the community, she's still finding ways to bring some of that into her home space. And then this last piece around, all these bodies of knowledge that she's learning through her family, through these communities, that show how transnational emergent multilingual, how their families possess rich bodies of knowledge, linguistic knowledge, literacy knowledge, experiential knowledge that can be accessed as a resource for teaching and learning. So a couple of implications, I tend to think about this in the form of questions, like what are things I'm still left thinking about that I think, could be taken up. So I think it would be interesting to think about what it might look like for example, the classroom that Paula was in, that's a sheltered English classroom. What might it look like for classrooms like that to engage in instruction that uses students' cultural knowledge and multilingual literacy practices to build and guide curriculum and to guide learning? What might it look like to view Paula or students like her as designers and constructors of language and literacy? What can we learn from positioning students as researchers of language and image and gesture and space and objects, right? Researchers of their own languaging practices to really push back on, whose language counts and who decides, what would it look like to empower students to think about that? And then finally, how are families locally and transnationally supporting their children's educational journeys the way that Paula's family is? And what can we do to recognize that, to build on it, and to continue supporting it? So I'll stop there and just open it up for questions or comments or however. I'll close this so that I can actually see people too.
Awesome job, Doctora Linares.
Cool.
Folks, feel free to drop in your questions or comments in the chat, or if you want to just unmute yourself, make sure you hit the reaction button at the bottom and raise your hand so you can come to the top of the screen and Rebecca can call on you for a question.
Thank you for being here on a Monday in really difficult circumstances and situations and all of that. I do appreciate people being here and listening and thinking about some of this. Oh, do I okay. Sorry, Sue, I see hands.
Okay, thank you. That was wonderful, super interesting. I found myself sort of jotting down and wondering about, you've labeled all of these different kinds of supports as a form of sponsorship. And I was wondering, one, I guess, how you landed on that. But when I started breaking it down in my head, I started thinking about the difference between those who were providing physical materials and those who were providing more oral language support. And in my mind, I was thinking particularly of the mother as being more of an apprenticeship in some sense. So I'm just curious about your categorization and how you thought it through. Because I really think that the difference between the Jehovah's Witness and the father and the brother is somewhat different than the other two. And yet they're all contributing to her language and literacy practices.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think to be honest, when I was thinking about like these relationships, like when I was initially looking at the data and analyzing the data, thinking like these folks are facilitating this. And so I started to think about what's the theory and literature around this. And I came across sponsorships. And initially that concept developed not in the context of multilingualism, right? That was sponsorships in monolingual contexts. And then Center Sapico took this up as this transnational piece to say that like, you don't have to be, in the same space with someone to still be a sponsor, to still be a supporter of the language and literacy development. So I felt very excited by that. Like it helped me kind of think about what I was seeing and like gave me a little bit of language to label what I was seeing. But I think what you're saying does add nuance that's not necessarily there in this theory and literature around sponsorship that is really interesting and definitely like something that I want to think about, because and again, this is like if I were to take more nuanced look at some of the dynamics of the relationships, I think that's where what you're saying could be really important, because you're right, there is this kind of apprenticeship, there is a different kind of intimacy in that relationship with her mother that's not necessarily the same with someone like the two Jehovah's Witness. So I appreciate the comment. Like it's great for helping me think more deeply about some of the nuances of this. Oh yeah. Oh,
I have Dr. Schultz, if you want to ask your question, and then I saw also Allison, Laura, and Joe with questions thereafter.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. And thank you, Rebecca, so much for a fabulous talk. I love thinking about literacy and the complexities that you describe it in literacy and languages. I've been thinking a lot about unaccompanied minors recently. I think probably because I talked with them and worked with them a little bit in California, and they're sort of, and because there's so much in the news right now, and I think your introduction wonderfully complicated who the unaccompanied minors are. And I'm just wondering if there are ways in which there being new arrivals in this country who are multilingual shape their language use, or if there are ways to connect. And this might not be as strong for Paula as for some of the other people in your study, but I just was wondering if you had sort of any insights into sort of crossing the politics of the border crossing that unaccompanied minors do and the translanguaging that you talked about.
Yeah, so hopefully I'll answer this as I'm thinking about it. So many of the students that actually all the students that I worked with were family reunification scenarios. So they were reuniting with family members, like either parents or siblings that had been in the United States for a period of time. So they were kind of plugging into some networks that were well established, and also some networks and communities that were somewhat insulated. So like I said, Paula's going to, she's able to grocery shop in a store where people speak one of her languages, right? Where she's around people that have some shared background, some shared experiences. So some of these young people are able to plug into communities that maybe mirror a little bit more the communities that they had at home, that I think is different here. The other piece is that all of these students were at a newcomer school. So they're in, sort of not quite a bubble, but like they're in a different kind of learning space. And so many of them are, you know, because like they were all assigned to this SLIFE cohort, the student with limited or interrupted formal ed, they're with students, with classmates who have had similar, some have had similar kinds of experiences. That this school was a mix of students like Paula and the others that I worked with, and also the state refugee agency, resettlement agency also is well connected with the school. So there were many kids who had been officially resettled as refugees from other countries. So it's a super linguistically and culturally diverse space. And I think that many kids found people that they were able to use their home languages with and establish like social relationships in their home language that may have been different than if they had been in another school setting or living in a community where they had fewer members of their home kind of community or home context and language. So I think that's really different for some of these students than maybe for others that go into schools where they don't have that same kind of network, or communities where they don't have the same networks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Hammond Ortiz, if you'd like to ask your question. We have a few more minutes. Maybe we can squeeze in the last two.
Sure, and I think Allison might have been next in line, but I'm happy to ask mine too if you want.
She's skipping her turn,
Okay. Great, thank you. Well, thank you for this presentation. It was beautifully given and just really, really compelling findings too. The question I have, I think, connects a little bit to Sue's. I've also found sponsorship to be a really interesting theoretical frame for thinking about literacy and who has access and who is providing access to different literacy experiences and opportunities. But I'm specifically interested in, so you named a lot of different ways that that the participant was engaging with literacy outside of school. And you also had the opportunity to see some of the ways that she was engaging within school. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that connection, like to what extent you saw some of these home practices and the different sponsors that you identified that were contributing to these spaces for these transnational literacy enactments taken up in school or not taken up in school. And then what would you think that the implications for teaching and for teachers should be based on what you learned?
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So with Paula, I really did not see a lot of what she does and talks about at home and in her community carried into the classroom. So there were opportunities. The teacher that I worked with was really big on dialogue journaling, which I've written and talked a lot about. And there were some students that were really like took up the leverage and space that she offered them to do kind of what they wanted in that writing space. So there were a lot of kids that did a lot of translanguaging there, that did that talked about these kind of communal and home funds of knowledge and like experiential knowledge and that sort of thing. Paula did not really. So she really I'm not remembering fully, but I don't recall many opportunities where she would translanguage in her writing, where she would write about any of these kind of home experiences or spaces. So I think, and part of that was, well, I think, so I guess the implication piece then would be, I think that we can explicitly invite students to make those connections. Like, what do you read at home? What do you write about at home? What do you think about at home? Like, and to help them realize that like what is happening in the classroom in English, for example, is building on skills and knowledges that they already have and that they already engage in another language, in another space, to help them kind of carry in some of that. And for the teacher to show them that like those practices that you do at home are valuable, right? Like you can build on those skills and that and those bodies of knowledge here in this space. She didn't really. So she was like, the teacher was like open to them using languages and writing about whatever they want. But I think maybe even more explicitly for students like Paula, who like have this idea of school as like, this is an English classroom. I want to think about and write about in English. And so she didn't quite take up that sort of implied flexibility, I guess.
Dr. Linares, I think we're wrapping up our questions.
Okay.
I know Dr. Pullman said that he had a very similar question to the last one.
Cool.
And then just to honor everybody's time. I know in the times of Zoom and COVID that folks often have another place to run to, but thank you
Absolutely.
so much
Thank you so
for
much,
sharing.
everyone,
Yeah,
for being
we
here.
appreciate you.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us. We are now we feel really good about getting some more of these talks on the docket now that we know we can do this on Zoom and hopefully making it meaningful. And so keep an eye out for the next one that we will be thinking about and planning, and we
Thank
hope
you.
to see you back.